Without further ado, I'm going to pass the torch over to Roz and we'll begin the presentations.
Thanks, Amy. I'm Roz Switzer, Middle Gila broadband leader for Great Old Broads of Wilderness, advocates for wilderness and wild lands. So in order to determine what the Mexican gray wolf needs to survive and thrive, we have to first look at how they're currently being managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So recovery is relying on two populations of Mexican gray wolves, one in the U.S., in Arizona and New Mexico, south of I-40, and one in Mexico. When these populations significantly increase, they will be capped at 320 wolves in the U.S. population and 170 wolves in the Mexico population. And reintroduction in Mexico began south of the boot heel of New Mexico, and 5 wolves were released at a private ranch in Sonora. Now, in Mexico, there is not large public lands like we have in the U.S., so that recovery does depend on these very large private land holdings that they have in Mexico. Currently, as of last year, there was approximately 30 wolves in Mexico, the majority in the mountains of the state of Chihuahua. So I applaud Mexico's recovery efforts for this species, but this should not be one of the core populations that recovery is dependent on. Mexico is a sovereign nation, and the U.S. does not dictate or control their program, and nor should we. So best available science also says that the habitat in Mexico can support only about 100 wolves. Historically, Mexican gray wolves would migrate along wildlife corridors between the U.S. and Mexico, but connectivity between these populations is now becoming non-existent. Nearly the entire border from San Diego to El Paso is in the process of being walled off. And this border wall is going to completely block off natural connectivity that has existed for thousands of years between these U.S. and Mexico habitats, and not just for the wolves, but for many species. Also, we have a history of capturing any wolves who have managed to wander north from the Mexican population. In 2017, we did have 2 wolves that made the journey north across the border using existing wildlife corridors, and a male crossed from Chihuahua into New Mexico. He spent the day at the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument, the portion that's close to the border, swung up and looped around Las Cruces, headed back down to El Paso, decided it was entirely too busy, and slipped through a then existent gap in the border wall. I seriously doubt if that gap still exists today. And on the right hand of your screen, you will see a female who dispersed north. She was located at a ranch south of the Chiricahua National Monument in Arizona, and Meet Sonora, as she was named by the public. She was linked to 1 livestock predation and captured and put into the captive breeding program in the U.S. And she's currently at the Wichita, Kansas Zoo, most probably never to return to the wild. So as discussed in the previous webinar, Mexican gray wolves in the wild are in genetic crisis. They are related like siblings. So under current management rules, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to consider the genetic crisis over and solved when, from the captive breeding facilities, 22 released wolves in the U.S. and 37 released wolves in Mexico reach breeding age. So there's no assurance that these released wolves are actually going to mate and have pups. The number is not a valid benchmark at all. It has no correlation to genes actually entering the wild gene pool. A genetic crisis should be over only when genetic testing shows that diversity has been achieved. And these 59 wolves, the 37 in Mexico, the 22 in the US, will include, or does include, cross-fostered pups. So what is a cross-fostered pups? Cross-fostering occurs when you place captive-born pups into wild dens. And you have a litter of pups born in the wild, and you have a litter of pups born in the captive breeding facility. They have to be within 10 days of each other in age, preferably less, but 10 days would work. The field team needs to know where the wild den is and approximately when the wild pups were born. And then the pups from the captive breeding facility have to be placed in the wild den within 2 weeks of their birth. So if all of this aligns, then the biologists take the captive born pups out to the wild den. They scoop all the pups out after the parents have left, and they take debris from the den and they rub the pups together with all this debris until they smell as close as possible alike, and then they put all of the pups back into the wild den. And then when the parents return, they happily take care of the pups. They don't differentiate between whether the pups are biological or not. They're very family oriented, and there's never been a situation where they haven't taken care of the pups. So this is a useful tool to increase diversity. You do get some different genes into the wild, but there is no basis for the claim that cross-fostering alone is going to reverse the downward slide of the genetics in the wild population. Significant cross-fostering has occurred since 2016, yet we continue to see increased genetic deterioration. So more authority has been given to state agencies by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The states are allowed to determine the location and timing of releases from the captive breeding facilities. And this makes no sense because these are the same state agencies that oppose releases of adults and family units. The Arizona Game and Fish Department Commission voted in 2015 to oppose all releases of adults and family units from the captive breeding facilities and support only cross-fostering. And in 2011, the New Mexico Game Commission voted to end participation in the recovery plan and then blocked releases. Now, just recently, they have re-entered the program, so we'll see how the current commission approaches wolf recovery. So since 2016, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has relied solely on cross-fostering to put new genes in the wild. And the southwestern states have undue influence not only on the timing and location of releases, but also on the content of both the 2015 10J rule, which is what we're discussing today. They had a lot of input into that, and the 2017 recovery plan, both of which are the templates for how the Mexican gray wolf population is managed. So the bottom line is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has relinquished a lot of their responsibility for the recovery of the Mexican gray wolf to these states who are actually hostile to their full recovery. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is not required to accommodate the recommendations of the states or local entities when they don't further the conservation of a listed species under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Wolves are managed differently in 3 management zones. What we have here is Arizona and New Mexico. And right here is the original Blue Range Wolf Recovery Area where wolves were released in 1998. In Zone 1, you can initially, you can release adult wolves, and you can cross-foster, and you can translocate wolves. In Zone 2, which is bounded by these highways here, you can cross-foster, translocate, or wolves can disperse naturally. You cannot release adult wolves onto public land in Zone 2, but adult wolves and family units can be released onto private or tribal land. This area here between the two legs of Zone 1 is the White Mountain Apache tribal lands, and they have participated in the program since 2003. They have their own field team, and they have they continue to have packs that they manage on 1.6 million acres of tribal land. And on the peripheries, you'll see Zone 3. And in Zone 3, wolves can naturally disperse only. There's not a lot of good habitat in Zone 3, but there is some habitat for wolves there. You'll also notice the northern boundary is I-40. If any wolf crosses that boundary, they are captured and returned to one of the management zones. And this is strictly a political boundary. There's no science-based reason to have I-40 as the northern boundary. So these wolf management zones need to be revisited. You can't put wolves on top of wolves without having conflicts in packs. And additionally, there is a lot of good habitat outside of these different zone boundaries. There is no requirement for livestock owners to adopt coexistence techniques on public lands, and there are many non-lethal tried and true methods that need to be incorporated into our forest management plans. You should remove livestock carcasses from the public lands. The majority of livestock die from natural causes, and if you leave the carcasses there, they can act as an attractant. You should avoid den and rendezvous sites because the wolves are raising their pups near these areas. Livestock owners could use guardian dogs, fencing, penning, and fladry. And fladry is pieces of plastic that flap in the wind, and they do scare wolves off, and for whatever reason they don't like to cross them. Now a lot of these things would work better maybe with sheep that are easier to pen, but they're still valid tools. We should increase on-the-ground presence using range riders, and I've seen some range riders in a couple times in the Apache Sitgraves National Forest. The last time I was walking outside of Wynn Campground, which is on the way to Big Lakes, and it was dusk, and there was a range rider with 3 very well-trained dogs, and the dogs and the range rider were herding up the cattle to bunch them together so they could be better protected at night. And additionally, you can use scare tools and tactics like alarms and lighting. And a couple things have been used in the Northwest, not so common here in the Southwest, but you can have your livestock calve at the same time, so you can increase protection when they're most vulnerable. And another success that they've had is that they've been able to hone livestock's instincts for herd behavior so that they can herd together and help to protect themselves. So there's a few other management flaws that are currently occurring. There is no plan for additional releases to compensate for human-caused mortality, and there's really no fruitful steps that have been taken to decrease it. There's a very high percentage of illegal killings, estimated at 60% of wolf mortality, and some studies show that that's actually low. And this is in addition to official removing and killing of wolves by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, usually for livestock predation, and almost all of it occurring on our public lands. So human-caused mortality needs to decrease substantially. Lastly, there's nothing in the current management plan that states what actions need to commence if recovery goals are not being met. When the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was asked about it, they said it would be discussed in their 5-year and 8-year review. So these wolves need a management rule and a recovery plan based on science. They're highly endangered wolves, and they should be considered recovered only when there is a stable, genetically healthy, ecologically effective population existing in the wild, which means affecting their niche in the environment the way that this predator should. So thank you, and Emily will continue the discussion on what these wolves need to survive and thrive.